Welcome to Historical Sleep Stories. Tonight, we journey back into the quiet world of the past, to a place where candlelight flickers softly through ancient halls, where rain falls gently beyond old windows, and history slowly comes alive beneath the calm of the night. So relax, get comfortable, and let tonight's story begin. It is the autumn of 1537. And the palace is very quiet tonight. Hampton Court Palace stands on the north bank of the River Thames, 12 miles west of London, in the county of Surrey, where the river bends slowly through water meadows and willow trees, and the particular flatness of the English countryside that makes the sky feel enormous and the horizon feel very far away. The palace has been here in one form or another since 1515. Cardinal Wolsey built it first. Thomas Wolsey, the son of an Ipswich butcher who became the most powerful churchman in England, who accumulated wealth and influence on a scale that made even kings uncomfortable, who built himself a palace on the Thames that was grander than any royal residence in the country. And then he gave it to the king. Or rather, he gave it to the king because Henry VIII made clear, in the particular way that Henry VIII made things clear, that the giving would be preferable to the alternative. Henry took the palace. He took it and he improved it. He added the great hall with its magnificent hammer beam roof, each beam carved and gilded and painted in the colors that the Tudors loved. Deep red and gold and green, the colors of power and wealth and the absolute certainty that God was on your side. He added the kitchens, the enormous labyrinthine kitchens that could feed a court of 1,000 people, that smelled of wood smoke and roasting meat, and the particular combination of herbs and spices that Tudor cooks used to preserve and flavor food in an era before refrigeration, before the modern understanding of what made food safe and what made it dangerous. He added the gardens, the formal gardens to the south and east of the palace, laid out in the geometric patterns that the Renaissance had brought from Italy to England, with their knot gardens and their topiary and their fountains and their beds of herbs and flowers arranged with a precision that was meant to demonstrate to anyone who walked through them that the natural world could be ordered and controlled by human intelligence and human will. Hampton Court was Henry's palace, his creation, his statement about who he was and what England was and what the Tudor dynasty meant. And in the autumn of 1537, as the leaves turned gold and red along the Thames and the river ran dark and slow between its banks, the palace was full of people and full of news. The Queen had given birth. Jane Seymour had delivered a son on the 12th of October. Edward, the boy that Henry had waited for through 6 years of marriage to Catherine of Aragon and 3 years of marriage to Anne Boleyn. The boy that 2 queens had failed to produce. The boy that England had been waiting for. He was healthy. He was alive. He was a prince. The bonfires had been lit across London. The church bells had rung for 3 days. The Te Deum had been sung in every cathedral and parish church in the country. Henry VIII, 56 years old and not in good health himself, had wept when he held his son for the first time. The court had celebrated, and then, 12 days after the birth of the prince who would save everything, Jane Seymour died, quietly, in her rooms at Hampton Court, of childbed fever, the physicians said, of infection, we would say now, knowing what they did not know. She died on the 24th of October, 1537, and the palace that had been celebrating became, almost overnight, a palace in mourning. But that is not our story tonight. Tonight, we are not in the rooms where queens die. Tonight, we are somewhere quieter, somewhere smaller, somewhere that the great events of the court reach only as distant sounds. A footstep in a corridor above, the muffled ring of a bell from the chapel, the faint smell of wood smoke from a fire in a room 3 floors away. Tonight, we are in the room of a woman named Alice Marsh. She is not a queen. She is not a lady of high rank. She is a seamstress, one of the dozens of women who work in the lower offices of Hampton Court, whose labor makes possible the extraordinary display of wealth and power and beauty that the court presents to the world, whose names do not appear in the history books, whose lives are lived in the spaces between the great events. Alice Marsh is 31 years old. She has worked at Hampton Court for 8 years. She arrived when she was 23, recommended by a distant cousin who worked in the kitchens, a quiet girl from a village in Berkshire who had been taught to sew by her mother and had turned out to have a talent for it that went beyond anything her mother had imagined or intended. She can do the fine work, the embroidery, the delicate repairs to the fabrics that courtiers and royalty wear, the silks and velvets and brocades that cost more than Alice will earn in a year, that tear and fray and pull at their seams from the simple daily wear of a life lived in expensive clothes. She has learned, over 8 years, to be invisible. This is the most important skill in her position. Not the sewing, though the sewing matters. The invisibility, the ability to be present in a room where important things are happening, and to register nothing, to show nothing, to be as unremarkable as the furniture, as unobtrusive as the light. She has become very good at it. Her room is on the 2nd floor of the east wing. It is a small room, not uncomfortable, but small. A bed with a wool blanket and a linen sheet that is clean and well maintained, because Alice is meticulous about such things. A chest at the foot of the bed where she keeps her clothes and her small collection of personal possessions. A stool, a table, and on the table, tonight, a candle, a single candle, burning steadily in the quiet air of the room. She has been sitting at this table for perhaps an hour since she finished her work for the evening and was dismissed from the room where she had spent the day doing alterations to a set of mourning clothes that the court requires. Now that the Queen is dead, black velvet, it takes more skill than it looks, working with velvet. The nap of the fabric has a direction, and if you sew against it, the difference is visible, a subtle shift in how the light falls on the surface that the eye picks up without quite knowing what it has noticed. Alice always sews with the nap. She has never needed to be told this twice. The palace at night has its own sounds, different from the sounds of the day. During the day, Hampton Court is a place of constant layered noise. The great hall with its hundreds of people eating and talking, the kitchens with their fires and their shouting and the clatter of pots and the thump of meat on boards, the corridors with their traffic of servants and officials and courtiers moving between the dozens of functions that a royal palace must perform simultaneously. All of that is gone now. The great hall is empty. The kitchens have been banked for the night, their fires reduced to embers that will be built up again before dawn when the cooks begin the preparation of the morning meal. The corridors are quiet, mostly. Occasionally, A footstep, a guard making his rounds, a servant on some late errand, but mostly quiet. The palace breathes differently at night, more slowly, more deeply, as though it, too, is resting. Alice can hear the river. This surprises people who have not experienced it. They expect the Thames to be loud, to announce itself the way that large things are supposed to announce themselves. But the Thames at Hampton Court at night is not loud. It is a presence more than a sound, a soft, continuous movement of water that you feel more than hear, a background to everything else, a reminder that the palace sits at the edge of something ancient and indifferent that was here before any of this was built and will be here after all of it is gone. She has always found this comforting. The river doesn't care about the death of queens. It doesn't care about the birth of princes. It moves. It carries what it carries. It goes where it goes. There is something restful in that. Tonight she is not sewing. She has been sewing all day, and her eyes are tired in the particular way that eyes become tired from fine work in poor light. A soreness behind them that is not quite pain, but is the border of pain. A heaviness that tells her she has asked too much of them for too long. She is sitting with her hands folded on the table, looking at the candle. The flame is still. The air in the room is very still tonight. No draught from the windows, which are closed against the October cold. No movement from the corridor, where the night has settled into its quiet. Just the candle, burning without flickering, its light falling soft and even on the table, on her hands, on the small objects arranged beside the candle. A thimble, a spool of black thread, a small pair of scissors with handles worn smooth from years of use, a piece of paper, folded once, that arrived for her this morning from the porter's lodge. She has read it twice already. She will read it again before she sleeps. The letter is from her sister, Margaret, who lives in the village in Berkshire where they were both born, where their mother still lives in the small house near the church, where the rhythms of life are so different from the rhythms of the palace that Alice sometimes has difficulty when she tries to hold both of them in her mind at the same time, making them feel like parts of the same world. Margaret has had a child, a daughter, born healthy in the first week of October, just before the news came from Hampton Court about the prince. Her name is Joan. Alice has not seen her sister in 2 years. She has not been home in 2 years. The palace is generous with many things, but it is not generous with time away. She looks at the letter, at Margaret's handwriting, which is not much better than it was when they were children, learning their letters together from the village priest, who had done his best with 2 girls who were not expected to need more than the basics. Margaret writes the way she speaks, simply, directly, without decoration. The baby is healthy. Mother is well. Father's grave was tended at Michaelmas. The harvest was good this year, better than last. She hopes Alice is keeping warm and eating properly. Alice reads this, and something moves in her chest. Not sadness exactly. Something more complicated. The particular feeling of belonging somewhere that you are not. She folds the letter carefully. She sets it back beside the candle. She looks out the window. The glass is old, the kind of glass that has slight imperfections in it, bubbles and ripples that distort the view slightly, that give everything seen through it a quality of being slightly other than itself. Through this glass, she can see a portion of the courtyard below, It is empty. The cobblestones are wet. There was rain earlier, a soft October rain that came in the late afternoon and lasted through the early evening. And they reflect the light from the few torches that burn through the night in the sconces along the courtyard walls. The reflections move slightly. The torches move slightly in a breeze she cannot feel from here. The cobblestones shine. The courtyard is empty, and Hampton Court is quiet. She has been thinking tonight about the Queen, not in the way that the court thinks about the Queen, not in the way that the councillors and the ladies of the bedchamber and the physicians think about her in terms of consequences and succession and the future of the kingdom. In a simpler way, she was, Alice thinks, a gentle woman, not clever in the way that Anne Boleyn had been clever, that quick, dangerous intelligence that Alice had observed from a careful distance during the years of Anne's ascendancy, the sharpness that could make a room feel smaller just by entering it. Jane Seymour hadn't have been like that. She had been quiet. She had been, from what Alice had observed in the small interactions that her work made possible, genuinely kind. She had spoken to the seamstresses and the laundresses and the kitchen women with a courtesy that was not common in people of her position, a courtesy that came from actually seeing the people she was speaking to rather than seeing through them. Alice had noticed this. She notices things. It is part of her skill. The candle has burned down perhaps an inch since she sat down. She does not know exactly how long she has been sitting here. The bells of the chapel chime the hours, and she has been only half listening, her mind moving through the events of the day and the words of Margaret's letter and the memory of the Queen and the sound of the river and the steady burn of the candle. She is not quite ready to sleep. There is a quality to this hour, this particular arrangement of quiet and candlelight and the soft sound of the palace breathing around her, that she finds difficult to leave voluntarily. She has always been this way. Even as a child in the village in Berkshire, she had been the one who stayed awake after her sister was asleep, lying in the dark and listening to the sounds of the house and the sounds of the village and thinking about nothing in particular, just being present in the night. Her mother had called it a bad habit. Alice has never entirely agreed. There is a sound in the corridor, soft, unhurried. Footsteps, not the brisk steps of a guard on his rounds. Something slower. Someone who is walking because they want to walk, not because they are going somewhere particular. The footsteps slow outside her door. Pause, continue, fade. She listens until she cannot hear them anymore. Then the corridor is quiet again. She does not know who it was. She does not need to know. The palace is full of people who cannot sleep tonight. There are reasons for that. The Queen is dead. The Prince is alive. And grief and relief and the complicated mixture of the two are keeping people awake in rooms all through this building, each of them sitting in their own small circle of candlelight, thinking their own thoughts, listening to the same river she is listening to. She is not alone. She is simply separate, which is not the same thing. She picks up the letter one more time, reads the last lines. Margaret's handwriting, simple and direct. The baby is healthy. Mother is well. She hopes Alice is keeping warm. She sets the letter down. She looks at the candle. She listens to the river. And very slowly, without deciding to, she begins to feel the weight of the day settling into her shoulders into the muscles of her hands and forearms that have been working since early morning, into the small ache behind her eyes that tells her the light is too much and the dark is what she needs. She reaches for the candle, cups her hand around the flame. The light in the room shifts, contracts, and then goes out. The darkness is not complete. There is the faint light from the torches in the courtyard below, coming through the imperfect glass of the window, just enough to make out the shapes of things. The chest at the foot of the bed, the stool, the table with its small objects. She stands. She moves to the bed. She lies down. She pulls the wool blanket over her. The river is still there, still moving, still carrying whatever it carries toward wherever it goes. The palace is still quiet around her. All those hundreds of people, sleeping and not sleeping, grieving and celebrating, and simply being in their own rooms, in their own darkness. The prince is alive. The queen is gone. And Hampton Court stands on the bank of the Thames, as it has stood since Wolsey built it, as it will stand long after everyone in it tonight is gone. Its stones holding the cold October air, its torches burning in the quiet courtyard, its river moving in the dark. Alice closes her eyes. The darkness behind them is warm. Her breathing slows. The palace breathes with her. And the night continues, as nights do, patient and unhurried, until the morning comes. The morning comes slowly to Hampton Court in October. Not the sudden brightness of a summer morning, when the light arrives almost before you expect it, flooding through the windows and demanding that the day begin. October mornings are more cautious than that. The light arrives gradually, grey first, then a pale gold that never quite becomes the warm gold of earlier months. A light that is honest about the season rather than generous with it. It comes through the eastern windows of the palace first, falling across the stone floors of the great hall and the long corridors in long, low rectangles that move almost imperceptibly as the sun climbs. By the time Alice wakes, the light has already been in the room for some time. She knows this because of the quality of it, the particular angle that tells her it is later than she usually wakes, that she has slept longer than is her habit, that the night was kind to her in the way that nights after difficult days sometimes are, giving more rest than expected, more depth of sleep than seemed possible when she lay down. She lies still for a moment, listening. The palace sounds different in the morning than it does at night. The silence is not complete, but it has a different quality, a silence that is ending rather than settling, that contains within it the first small sounds of a building waking up. Somewhere below her, the kitchens are already active. She can hear it, just barely, through 2 floors of stone and wood and plaster, the clatter of pots, a voice, indistinct, the particular rhythm of work beginning. She sits up. The room is cold, October cold, the kind that has settled into the stone overnight and will not lift until the fire in the great hall has been burning for several hours, and even then will persist in the corners and along the walls, a residual cold that is simply the nature of stone buildings in the English autumn. She dresses quickly, practical movements, well practiced, the clothing of a working woman in the Tudor court, modest and functional, designed for movement and for the long hours of sitting that her work requires. She pins her hair without a mirror. She has done this for so long that she no longer needs one. and takes her work bag from the peg behind the door where she left it the night before. Before she leaves the room, she pauses at the window. The courtyard below is no longer empty. A group of men cross it, moving with the purposeful speed of people who have somewhere to be and are already late getting there. Their breath makes small clouds in the cold air. Their footsteps on the wet cobblestones have a different sound than they will have in an hour when the stone has dried. A heavier, more resonant sound that is one of the particular sounds of October mornings at Hampton Court that she has come to know without being aware of knowing it. Beyond the courtyard, she can see the tops of the trees along the river. Their leaves are mostly gone now. The branches are bare against the grey sky. That particular delicate tracery of winter branches that is its own kind of beauty, different from the beauty of the same branches in summer, but not lesser. She watches for a moment, then she goes to work. The sewing room is on the ground floor of the south wing. It is a long room, low-ceilinged, with 3 windows that look out onto the kitchen gardens. In summer, the gardens are productive and interesting, full of the herbs and vegetables that the kitchens require, tended by the gardeners, whose work Alice watches with a kind of professional appreciation, recognizing in their careful attention to growing things something that mirrors her own careful attention to fabric and thread. In October, the kitchen gardens are mostly done for the year. The beds have been cleared and turned, and the gardeners are preparing them for the winter, covering them with straw and old leaves to protect the soil from the hardest frosts. Alice sits at her usual place, the stool closest to the middle window, where the light is best. She opens her work bag, takes out the piece she was working on yesterday, the black velvet, mourning clothes for the court. The palace has been draped in black since the Queen's death, a great formal expression of grief that requires an enormous quantity of black cloth and an enormous amount of skilled labor to produce, maintain, and repair. Alice and the other women who work in the sewing room have been doing almost nothing else since the Queen died. She threads her needle, takes a breath, begins. The other women come in 1s and 2s over the next half hour. Margaret Fletcher, who has worked in the sewing room longer than Alice, and who occupies the status of senior seamstress with a quiet authority that nobody has ever formally acknowledged, but everyone observes. She is perhaps 45, broad-shouldered, with the permanently slightly curved posture of someone who has spent decades bending over fine work, and hands that are as competent as any Alice has seen. Dorothy Ward, who is younger than Alice and who has not yet fully learned the art of invisibility that the work requires, who still has the tendency to express her reactions to things on her face in ways that can be inconvenient when those reactions are to people of higher rank than her own. Anne Clifton, who is quiet in a different way than Alice, quiet in the way of someone who is always listening rather than quiet in the way of someone who is comfortable not speaking. She has been at Hampton Court for as long as Margaret Fletcher, and she knows things that she has never told anyone, that Alice can sometimes sense in the quality of her silence. And Mary Holton, the youngest, who arrived 6 months ago from somewhere in the north of England, and who is still learning, who makes small mistakes that the others correct with varying degrees of patience, and who will be very good in a year or two if she can survive the learning. These are the people Alice spends most of her days with. She knows them the way you know people you work alongside in close quarters for years. The particular way each of them moves, the sounds they make when they are concentrating and when they are not, the small habits that become so familiar they are no longer noticed. She would not, if asked, say that she was close to any of them, but she would not, if asked, say that she was not. The morning passes in the way that mornings in the sewing room pass, work and quiet, the occasional exchange of words about practical matters, the thread, the fabric, the quantity of what remains to be done, and the question of whether it can be completed in the time available. Occasionally, something else. A piece of news from the court above them, arriving through the particular channels by which news travels in a large household, the kitchens and the laundries and the corridors and the rooms where servants wait, the network of observation and communication that operates alongside and beneath the official life of the palace. This morning, the news is about the prince. He is well. He fed in the night and slept and is feeding again this morning. His color is good. The physicians are satisfied. Alice listens to this as she works. She is glad the prince is well. She thinks about the queen who died to produce him. She thinks about her sister Margaret's daughter Joan, born in a village in Berkshire at roughly the same moment, alive and healthy in very different circumstances. She thinks about the strange arithmetic of lives, how many of them there are, how different they are from each other, how each one is the whole world to the person living it, and barely a detail to everyone else. At mid-morning, Margaret Fletcher sets down her work and stands. She has the particular movement of someone whose joints have been protesting the cold and the sitting for some time, and who has decided, finally, to do something about it. She crosses to the window and looks out at the kitchen garden for a moment, and then she turns and looks at the room with the expression of someone conducting an assessment. She says they need more thread, black thread. They have been using it faster than anticipated, and the supply in the workroom is running low. She looks at Alice. Alice is the one she sends for supplies. Not because Alice is junior, exactly. Because Alice is efficient and quiet, and returns promptly and causes no complications. Alice sets down her work, takes the key from the hook by the door, goes to get the thread. The supply room is 2 corridors away and down a half flight of stairs in the part of the palace that visitors never see, that exists entirely to make possible the visible life of the court. The corridor she walks through to reach it is stone-floored and low-ceilinged, lit by small windows at irregular intervals that give it a slightly cave-like quality, a sense of being underground, even when you are not. She has walked this corridor hundreds of times. She knows it the way she knows her own hands. Every unevenness in the floor, every place where the ceiling is lower than expected, every draft that comes through the joint between the wall and the floor on the north side, where the stonework is older and has settled slightly away from itself over the centuries. She walks quickly, not because she is in a hurry exactly, because this is how she walks in corridors, with the purposeful movement of someone who has somewhere to be, which discourages the kind of idle conversation that can make a simple errand take 3 times as long as it should. She is passing the alcove near the second window when she sees him, a boy, perhaps 6 or 7 years old, sitting in the alcove, which is just wide enough to hold a small bench that has been there for as long as Alice can remember. Its purpose unclear, its existence accepted as one of those features of an old building that simply is without needing to be explained. The boy is sitting on the bench. He is crying, not loudly, not in the way of children who are crying for attention or affect, in the quiet way of someone who is trying not to cry and is not entirely succeeding. He has dark hair and a pale face, and he is wearing clothes that are of better quality than you would expect to find a child wearing in this part of the palace. Not the clothes of the highest rank, but not the clothes of a servant's child either, something in between, which makes his presence here more puzzling rather than less. Alice stops. She looks at him. He looks at her. Neither of them speaks for a moment. Then she says, in the quiet voice she uses when she does not want to make a situation larger than it is, "Are you lost?" He considers this question with the seriousness of a child who takes questions seriously. He says he is not lost. He knows where he is. She says, "Then why are you crying?" He says he is not crying. She looks at his face. He looks at her looking at his face. He says, "Well, perhaps a little." His name is Thomas. He does not tell her his surname, and she does not ask, because surnames in the Tudor court are information that needs to be handled carefully, that carry implications about allegiances and families and positions that Alice has learned over 8 years not to get entangled in unless she has to. Thomas is enough. He is, he tells her, in this corridor because he was supposed to be somewhere else, and then something happened, and now he is here, and he is not certain what to do next. She asks what happened. He is quiet for a moment. He says there was a lesson, and the lesson was about the Queen, and he did not like it, and he left. Alice considers this. She is aware, supposed to be spending time talking to an unknown child in a back corridor when there is work waiting for her in the sewing room. Margaret Fletcher will notice if she is gone too long. But there is something about this child, the quality of his quietness, the way he is trying to manage his face. She has seen that before, in herself, if she is honest. She sits down on the bench beside him, not close, just nearby. She says, "What was the lesson?" He says it was about how the Queen died, and why she died, and what it means that she died. And he says this last part with a slight emphasis that makes it clear he is repeating something he heard from someone else, some adult's way of framing the question. What it means that she died. Alice is quiet for a moment. Then she says, "What do you think it means?" He thinks about this for a long time, longer than most adults would think about it. He has that quality of stillness that serious children sometimes have, the ability to actually stop and consider a question rather than immediately reaching for the first available answer. He says he doesn't know. He says the people in the lesson seemed to know. They seemed very certain about what it meant. The Queen died, and it meant this. The Prince lived, and it meant that. But he says it felt like they were talking about a story, not about a person. Alice looks at him. She says, "Did you know her?" He shakes his head. He says he saw her once, in the gallery. She was walking with her ladies, and she smiled at him. He did not know who she was at the time. He found out afterward. He says she had a kind face. Alice thinks about this. She thinks about what she said to herself last night, sitting at the table with the candle about the Queen being a gentle woman, about the way she had spoken to the working women of the court as though they were actually there. She says, yes, she did. They sit together in the alcove for a while. It is not, strictly speaking, what either of them should be doing. But the corridor is quiet and no one passes, and the light through the small window is the thin grey light of an October morning in England, which has a particular quality of its own. Not warm, but not harsh. A light that is honest rather than flattering, and that makes the stone walls of this corridor look exactly like what they are. Very old and very solid, and here for a long time before either of them was born, and likely to be here for a long time after. She asks him if he is feeling better. He considers this with the same seriousness he brought to the previous question. He says a little. She says good. She says she has to go get something and then go back to her work. He says, all right. She stands. She looks at him. She says, the lesson was right, that things have meanings. But the people teaching it were probably wrong about what the meanings are. Usually are. He looks at her with an expression she cannot entirely read. He says, how do you know what the meanings are then? She thinks about this. She thinks about Margaret's letter, about the baby Joan, born in a village the same week a queen died in a palace, about the river that doesn't care about either of them, about the candle burning in the quiet of her room. She says, you don't always, but you start by remembering that the people in the stories were people, not just parts of stories. He nods slowly, as if this makes sense to him. She goes to get the thread. She thinks about the boy for the rest of the morning. She does not know who he is. She does not know what family he belongs to, what brought him to Hampton Court, what the lesson was that upset him enough to make him leave and sit alone in a back corridor, trying not to cry. She probably will never know. The palace is full of people she will never know. That is simply the nature of a place this size, this complex, this layered. But she thinks about what he said, about the lesson feeling like they were talking about a story rather than a person. She knows that feeling. She has had it herself. In the 8 years she has been here, watching the great events of the court from the particular vantage point of her invisibility. The way that things become stories almost before they have finished happening. The way that the people in them become characters in the story rather than the people they were. Jane Seymour will become a story. She already is, a little. The gentle queen who gave the king his son and died for it. It is true, as far as it goes. But it is not all that is true. Alice sat 2 rooms away from the queen's apartments on the night she died, hearing through the stone walls the sounds of a death she could not see, thinking about the woman she had observed walking through the gallery with her ladies, the woman who smiled at a child she didn't know, the woman who had been a person with her own thoughts and her own fears and her own way of seeing the world, and who was now becoming a story that would travel down the centuries until the story was all that was left. This always happens. Alice knows this. She has known it for a long time. It does not make it less strange. At midday, the work is set aside briefly. The women eat together in the sewing room. The simple food that is brought from the kitchens for the working servants of the palace. Bread, a piece of cheese, something warm, a broth, thicker and more sustaining on cold days. They eat without much conversation. This is not unfriendliness. It is the particular quality of people who have been working together all morning and have reached the hour of the day when the body is asking for food rather than words. Alice eats and thinks about the afternoon ahead. More black velvet, more careful stitches following the nap, more of the quiet, focused, patient work that has been her life for 8 years and that she is, she thinks, suited to in ways that are not entirely about skill. The patience, the willingness to do the same thing many times without finding it less worth doing. The ability to be present in a room without demanding that the room be arranged around her. These are not glamorous qualities, but they are real ones. And they have given her a life that is, if she is honest with herself, not unhappy. After eating, she goes to the window. The kitchen. Garden is quiet at this hour. The gardener's gone somewhere else for their own midday meal. The beds are still and brown and bare. Beyond them, through the gate in the wall, she can see the corner of the great garden, the formal garden with its geometric beds and its bare branched topiary, its fountains turned off now for the winter, the stone basins dry. And beyond that, just visible over the garden wall, the tops of the trees along the river. The river itself she cannot see from here, but she can hear it, just beneath everything else, beneath the sounds of the palace resuming its afternoon work around her, beneath the scrape of Dorothy's stool as she settles back to her sewing, beneath the small sounds of thread and needle and the soft resistance of velvet, the river, moving, carrying what it carries, going where it goes. She turns from the window. She goes back to work. The afternoon light in the sewing room is different from the morning light. In the morning, the light comes through the windows with a quality of arrival, of something beginning. It is the light of a day that has not yet declared itself, that is still in the process of becoming. The afternoon light at Hampton Court in October has already decided what it is. It is low and golden and slightly melancholy, the light of a season that knows it is ending, that has given what it has to give and is now in the process of withdrawing. It comes through the windows at an angle that makes the dust in the air visible, small particles turning slowly in the light, and it falls across the fabric in Alice's hands with a warmth that the morning light does not have. She prefers it. The morning light is more practical for close work, clearer and more even. But the afternoon light is more honest somehow, more willing to show things as they actually are rather than as they might be. She has always found that honesty in light more restful than the ambiguity of brightness. Dorothy Ward makes a mistake in the early afternoon, a small one, a seam that pulls slightly wrong, a tension in the thread that is just barely visible if you know what to look for and look at the right angle. She does not notice it herself. Margaret Fletcher notices it. She points it out in the way she points such things out, without cruelty but without softness either, with the directness of someone who has decided long ago that kindness in the form of allowing mistakes to persist is not actually kindness. Dorothy's face goes through several things in quick succession. Embarrassment, the particular self-directed frustration of someone who knows they have made an error they should not have made. And then, briefly, something more like distress. Alice watches this without appearing to watch. She has the sewing in her hands and her eyes appear to be on the sewing. But she is watching Dorothy. She has always been this way, noticing the things that happen between people that are not said directly, the small emotional weather that passes through a room in the spaces between words. Dorothy unpicks the seam, starts again. Her movements are slightly more careful than they were before, slightly more self-conscious. This is the problem with being corrected in company. The self-consciousness that follows tends to produce exactly the kind of errors it is trying to prevent. Alice reaches the end of a section of her own work. She cuts the thread. She sets the piece down for a moment. She says to Dorothy, without looking up from rethreading her needle, that the velvet is particularly difficult today, that the light in the afternoon makes it harder to see the nap clearly. This is true. It is also not why Dorothy made the mistake, but it gives Dorothy somewhere to put her embarrassment that is not entirely her own failure. Dorothy's movements over the next half hour gradually become more natural. Margaret Fletcher says nothing. She has been here long enough to understand what Alice did and why. Anne Clifton's eyes flick briefly to Alice, the smallest acknowledgement. Mary Holton notices nothing. She is concentrating too hard on her own work to notice anything else. This is the texture of the day. This is what a day in the sewing room at Hampton Court actually is, beneath the surface of needle and thread and the formal purpose of producing mourning clothes for a court in grief. It is these small moments, the correction and its aftermath, the quiet navigation of the space between people, the 1,000 tiny adjustments that are made continuously and largely invisibly to keep the room working, to keep the people in it able to do what they are there to do. Alice has been making these adjustments for 8 years. She is not sure she could entirely describe what she does if asked. She is not sure she has ever been asked. It is not the kind of work that gets noticed, but it is real, and it matters, in the way that all the invisible work matters, the work that holds things together without being seen to hold them. By the middle of the afternoon, the piece she has been working on is nearly done. It is a sleeve, part of a formal morning gown for one of the ladies of the court, a woman Alice knows by sight but not by name, who moves through the upper floors of the palace in the way of someone who is important enough not to need to move quickly. The sleeve is black velvet over a lining of black silk. The seams must be invisible from the outside. The silk must lie perfectly smooth inside. The sleeve must hang with the exact geometry that the garment requires, not pulling or bunching at the shoulder seam, not tightening around the wrist when the arm bends. Alice has made dozens of sleeves. She will make dozens more, each one the same in its essentials and slightly different in its particulars, because fabric is never exactly the same twice, because the woman who will wear the sleeve has a particular arm with a particular length and circumference and way of moving, because the act of making something well requires constant small adjustments to account for the constant small variations in the materials and the requirements. This is what she thinks about when people who do not sew imagine that sewing must be boring. It is not boring. It is the opposite of boring. It is the work of continuous attention to continuous variation. The moment you stop paying attention is the moment the mistake appears. She finishes the sleeve as the afternoon light begins to fail. The low golden light becomes lower and less golden, becomes the thin grey of approaching evening, becomes the moment when the windows stop being useful and the candles need to be lit. Mary Holton lights the candles. This is one of her jobs, as the most junior woman in the room. She does it carefully, with the particular conscientiousness of someone who understands that small tasks done well are the beginning of larger responsibilities. Alice watches her, thinks again that she will be good. The candlelight changes the room. It always does. The effect of candles is not simply to replace the daylight that is leaving. It is to create a different kind of space, smaller, more intimate, with edges that fade into shadow rather than the clear boundaries that daylight provides. The sewing room in candlelight is a different room than the sewing room in daylight. The women in it are slightly different women. More themselves, perhaps. The small performances that the presence of daylight seems to require, the performance of competence, of purpose, of being seen to be engaged in productive activity, relax slightly in the candlelight. There is a permission in the evening hours that the morning does not offer. Margaret Fletcher rolls her shoulders, the movement of someone releasing tension that has accumulated over a long day. Anne Clifton sets down her work and rubs her eyes with the heels of her hands. Dorothy Ward exhales. Mary Holton, having lit the last candle, looks around the room with an expression that is, for once, not self-conscious. Alice takes a slow breath. The day is nearly done. She thinks about the boy again. Thomas, sitting in the alcove in the back corridor, trying not to cry. Saying the lesson felt like they were talking about a story rather than a person. She wonders where he is now, whether he found his way back to wherever he was supposed to be, whether the lesson continued without him. Those adults very certain about what things meant, talking about the Queen as though she were already a character in a history that had been written, rather than a woman who had been alive 3 weeks ago. She thinks about what she said to him. You start by remembering that the people in the stories were people. It is easy to say. She is not always sure it is easy to do. Even she, who tries, who has made it a kind of private discipline over 8 years of watching the court. Even she sometimes catches herself thinking of the great figures of the court as figures rather than as people, as pieces on a board rather than as humans with cold feet in the morning and trouble sleeping, and letters from home that they read twice before they go to bed. It requires effort, the effort of continuously refusing the simplification that the story wants to impose. But it is worth making. She is sure of that. The evening meal is simple. The women eat together as they do at midday, but the evening meal has a different quality. The work of the day is behind them. There is no tomorrow's work yet pressing forward. There is this hour, and the food, and the company of people who have spent the day in the same room doing the same careful labor. Margaret Fletcher, who almost never speaks about anything personal, says something about the cold, about how the cold this year has come earlier than usual. She says her hands remember cold years. She says there was a winter, perhaps 15 years ago, when the Thames froze at London. She does not elaborate, but she says it with the particular quality of someone who is offering a small piece of themselves, something real, something that is not about the work. Dorothy Ward asks what it was like. Margaret describes it briefly. the strangeness of it, the ice so thick that people walked on it, fires lit on the frozen surface, the river that always moved, standing completely still. Alice listens. She has heard of this. She tries to imagine the Thames standing still. The river that she can hear from her room on quiet nights, that she has listened to for 8 years, the constant movement of it, the constancy that is itself a kind of comfort, standing still. She cannot quite manage the imagination of it, but she can imagine what it would mean to see it, to see the thing that is always moving, stopped, to understand, in a new way, that the constancy is not inevitable, that even the most reliable things can be altered by sufficient cold. After the meal, the women separate, each to her own room. The particular privacy of the evening hours, the time that belongs to no one else, that the palace does not have a claim on. Alice walks the corridor back to her room. The same corridor she walked this morning in the other direction. The same uneven floor. The same draught from the north wall. The same alcove where Thomas sat this morning, trying not to cry. She pauses at the alcove. It is empty. Of course it is empty. She does not know why she expected anything else. She continues to her room. The candle is where she left it. She lights it. The room comes back into its familiar proportions, the candlelight creating the same small world it created last night. The table and its objects, the chest, the bed, the window with its imperfect glass. She goes to the window. The courtyard below is quieter than last night. Fewer torches. The palace settling into its deepest evening hours. Through the imperfect glass, the reflections of the remaining torches on the wet cobblestones. Beyond the courtyard, darkness. And beneath the darkness, beneath everything, the river. She stands at the window for a while. She is thinking about the day, about Dorothy and the seam and the small navigation of the afternoon, about Margaret Fletcher and the frozen Thames, about Thomas in the alcove and what she said to him, about Jane Seymour, who had a kind face, who's becoming a story, about Margaret's letter on the table beside the candle, about Joan, who was born in a village in Berkshire and who will grow up knowing nothing of Hampton Court, of queens and princes and mourning cloth, of the particular world that exists inside these walls, and who will be, for that, Alice thinks, not poorer, simply different, simply herself, in her own world, which will be the whole world to her, as every world is. She picks up the letter, reads it again. The handwriting that has not much improved since childhood, the simple sentences. The baby is healthy. Mother is well. She hopes Alice is keeping warm. She folds the letter. She holds it for a moment. Then she puts it in the chest at the foot of the bed, with the other letters from Margaret, the ones she has received over 8 years, the careful record of a life being lived somewhere else by someone she loves. She goes back to the table. She sits down. She looks at the candle. Outside, the river. In the palace around her, hundreds of people moving through their own evenings. The prince somewhere in the upper rooms, in the care of the nurses who will tend him through the night. The grief of a court that has lost its queen and gained its heir. The ordinary life of the palace going on around and beneath all of it. Candles being lit and put out. Fires being banked. People lying down in the dark and waiting for sleep. She does not reach for her sewing. She simply sits. This is, she has found, sometimes what the body needs at the end of a day. Not activity, not sleep yet either, just the sitting. the being present in the room with the candle, and the sound of the river and the dark outside the window. The palace breathes around her. She breathes with it. Her hands rest in her lap. Her eyes are soft on the candle flame, which is still and steady in the quiet air. The night is full of small sounds. A door somewhere below. The wind in the courtyard, picking up slightly. The river. Always the river. She sits until the candle has burned down another inch, until her eyes have grown heavy without her deciding they should, until the weight of the day has settled into a quality of rest that is already almost the beginning of sleep. Then she rises. She moves to the bed. She lies down. She pulls the blanket over her. Outside, the river keeps moving. Inside, the palace keeps breathing. And Alice closes her eyes and lets the night do what nights do. 3 days after the Queen's death, the palace changes. Not all at once, not dramatically, but Alice notices it, the way she notices everything, from the particular vantage point of her invisibility. The mourning is still present. The black cloth is still everywhere. The court still moves with the careful, measured gravity of people who are performing grief in the formal way that the court requires. But underneath the formal grief, something is shifting. Life is reasserting itself. This is what life does. It does not wait for grief to finish. It simply continues, alongside the grief, beneath it, around it, with the same patient indifference as the river. Alice notices it first in the kitchens. She passes the kitchen corridor on her way to the supply room one morning, and the sounds coming from behind the closed doors are slightly different from the sounds of the past 3 weeks. Still work, still the clatter and the shouting and the rhythmic sounds of food being prepared for a large number of people. But something in the rhythm is slightly lighter. A laugh, quickly suppressed. A voice singing under its breath, just a few notes, stopped before it becomes anything. Small signs. But Alice notices. She notices it in the sewing room too. Dorothy Ward makes a mistake on Thursday afternoon. The same kind of mistake she made on Monday. A seam that pulls slightly wrong. But this time, when Margaret Fletcher points it out, Dorothy's face does not go through the same sequence of expressions. She looks at the mistake. She unpicks it. She says, "I see it," and starts again. Without the self-conscious tension that made the correction so difficult on Monday. She has, in 3 days, grown slightly more able to absorb correction without being undone by it. This is small, but it is real. It is the thing that learning looks like, up close, when you are watching it carefully. Alice watches, says nothing, continues with her own work. On Thursday evening, she goes to the garden. This is unusual for her. She is not a person who goes to the garden in October, when the cold makes the outside something to be endured rather than enjoyed. She is a person who stays indoors when the weather gives her a reason to, who finds the interior world of the palace sufficient on most evenings. But something draws her out. She cannot explain it exactly. Only that the room felt, for once, smaller than she wanted it to be. She wraps herself in her wool cloak and goes down the back stairs and out through the door that opens onto the kitchen garden side. The cold hits her immediately. The particular cold of an October evening that has been building all day and has now arrived at its sharpest. The cold that has a smell, a clean mineral smell that is partly frost and partly the damp earth of the garden beds, and partly something else entirely. something that belongs to October and to this particular hour of it. She breathes it in, stands still for a moment. The garden is dark. There are torches at the corners of the courtyard beyond the garden wall, their light reaching only a little way into the garden itself, just enough to make out the shapes of the beds and the path between them. She walks the path. Her breath makes small clouds in the cold air. Her footsteps on the stone path are quiet but distinct in the silence. She walks slowly, not going anywhere, just walking. At the far end of the kitchen garden, there is a gate in the wall. It leads to a narrow passage between the kitchen garden wall and the wall of the next courtyard. She has been through this gate 100 times. She goes through it now. The passage is darker than the garden. The torchlight from the courtyard does not reach here. She stands in the dark for a moment, letting her eyes adjust. And then she sees it. At the far end of the passage, where it opens onto a small court she rarely has occasion to visit, there is a light, not a torch, a candle, or something like a candle, held by someone standing at the far end of the passage. She moves toward it. It is Thomas. He is standing at the end of the passage, holding a small lantern, the kind that servants carry on errands after dark. He is looking at something beyond the courtyard, in the direction of the river. She says his name. He turns. He does not seem surprised to see her. He says, "Good evening." She says, "Good evening." She says, "What are you doing here?" He says, "He comes here sometimes, when he wants to hear the river." She understands this immediately. She says, "You can hear it from here?" He says, "On quiet nights, when the wind is right." She stands beside him. She listens. The palace is quiet around them. The courtyard is empty. And there, beneath everything, beneath the cold air and the darkness and the distant sound of the torches in the wind, the river. They stand together for a while without speaking. This does not feel awkward. It feels like the appropriate response to the situation. Two people listening to the same sound in the dark. After a while, he says, "Is it always there?" She says yes. "Always." He says, "Even when it's very loud inside? When there are lots of people and noise?" She says yes. "Even then? You just can't hear it." He thinks about this. He says, "That's good." She says, "Yes, I think so too." He asks her what her name is. She tells him. He tells her his full name, Thomas Seymour, the brother of the Queen who died. She had not known this. She looks at him in the dim light from his lantern. He is 6 or 7 years old. He has lost his sister. He is standing in a dark passage at Hampton Court, listening to the river. She does not say she is sorry for his loss. This is what adults say, and it is true, and it is also somehow insufficient, a formula that names the thing without touching it. She says nothing for a moment. Then she says, "She was kind. Your sister. I saw her once in the gallery. She smiled at someone she didn't know." He looks at her. He says, "She did that. She smiled at people." She says, "Yes, I noticed." He turns back toward the river. He stands with his lantern in the dark. A boy who has lost his sister and is standing in a passage at the edge of a palace, listening to the water move. She stands beside him. They do not stay long. The cold is too much for standing still. After a while, she says she should go back inside. He says yes. He says he should too. They walk back through the gate, into the kitchen garden, and across the garden to the door she came out of. At the door, she pauses. She says, "Good night, Thomas." He says, "Good night." He says, "Thank you." She does not ask for what. She simply nods and goes inside. That night, she sits at her table for a long time. The candle burns. The river is there, as it always is, beneath everything. She thinks about Thomas Seymour, 6 or 7 years old, the brother of a queen, standing in the dark with his lantern. She thinks about what he said in the alcove 3 days ago, about the lesson feeling like a story rather than a person. She thinks about what she knows now that she did not know then, that the boy who felt that was the Queen's own brother, that his grief is not abstract, that when he said she had a kind face, he was not speaking from one brief observation in a gallery. He was speaking from a lifetime of knowing her. She thinks about how much is always unseen, how much of what passes before her eyes every day carries a weight and a history that she cannot see, that exists entirely in the interior lives of the people she observes from her careful, invisible vantage point. The sleeve she sewed this week will be worn by a woman she does not know. The mourning cloth she has spent weeks working on will dress a court in grief for a woman she observed from a distance. The boy in the alcove turned out to be the dead queen's brother. She cannot know these things in advance. She can only keep paying attention, keep noticing, keep refusing the simplification, keep remembering that the people in the stories are people. November comes to Hampton Court. The leaves are gone from the trees along the river. The garden is bare and brown and ready for winter. The mourning period of the court has its own formal duration, its own prescribed rhythms of grief and gradual return to normal life. And those rhythms are beginning now to move the palace forward, slowly, in the direction of what comes next. The prince is healthy. He has survived the first critical weeks. The physicians are cautiously optimistic. The court is beginning, very carefully, to look toward the future. Alice continues her work. The mourning clothes will be needed for some time yet. Then the work will change. It always changes. New clothes for new occasions. New cloth requiring new attention. The continuous variation within the continuous sameness of the work. She is, she thinks, content with this. Content is the right word. Not thrilled, not ecstatic. Content. In the way of someone who has found a life that fits them. Not perfectly. No life fits perfectly. But well enough, with enough space for the things she values, the quiet, the attention, the particular satisfaction of work done carefully, the sound of the river at night. On a morning in the second week of November, she sees Thomas Seymour one more time. She is crossing the great court on an errand, and he is on the other side of it, walking with a group of adults, men and women of the court, who are escorting him somewhere. He does not see her, or if he sees her, he does not show it. She watches him cross the court, a small figure among the adults, walking with a steadiness that is, she thinks, fairly remarkable for a child who has lost his sister 3 weeks ago. She watches until the group disappears through the door at the far end of the court. Then she continues on her errand. And now, dear listener, as the night settles over Hampton Court Palace, and the candles burn low in the long corridors, and the kitchens are quiet, and the prince sleeps in his royal nursery, and the court rests in its formal grief and its private grief, and all the complicated spaces between the two, it is time for you to rest as well. Alice Marsh is in her room. The candle is burning on the table. The letter from her sister is in the chest. Her hands are resting in her lap. Her eyes are soft on the candle flame. The river is there, as it always is, beneath everything, moving through the dark in the way it has moved for longer than anyone can remember, carrying what it carries, going where it goes, indifferent and faithful and always, always present. Let your breathing slow now, long and easy, in and out. Let the warmth of wherever you are settle around you. Let the sounds of your own night become simply part of the quiet, in which everything rests. The palace is here, the river is here. The small, invisible life that holds the world together is here, in all the rooms and corridors and quiet corners where people do their careful work and pay their quiet attention and remember, against all the pressure to forget, that the people in the stories are people. Alice Marsh is sleeping now. Her candle has burned down to its last inch, and the light in the room is very low and warm, and the darkness at the edges of it is soft and close, and not threatening at all. The darkness of a room that is familiar and safe. The darkness that comes before sleep, and that sleep will complete. Let your eyes close now. They have seen enough for today. The river is there. It will be there when you wake. All is well. All is quiet. All is, in its own patient and enduring way, at rest. Good night. This has been Historical Sleep Stories. We will be here again tomorrow night with another story, another place, another quiet journey into the past. Until then, rest.